And then we have the president of the United States who is signing on for this nonsense that the globalist leaders of Western Europe want to do in order to sustain and promote the conflict. He's got to get it through his head that they are not his friends. They are not his allies. They are globalists. That's where it is. He can either do business with them or he can cut them off and say, we're out because we don't want a war with Russia. We're not supporting this anymore. He understands that, but he's failed to do it repeatedly. Destruction, the complete annihilation of the Ukrainian military, and ultimately the extinction of the Ukrainian government. Look, McCall doesn't know what he's talking about. Look up the people that donate to McCall's campaigns, where his money comes from. That'll answer most of your questions about why he says what he does. The man knows nothing, absolutely nothing about Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine, or anything else. That's true for most people on the Hill. So at the end of the day, in Russia, they look at this and they see no real rays of hope whatsoever. If we stopped supplying the Ukrainians, which is something we should have done months ago, if we said we're stopping this, and if you don't negotiate, there will be no resumption under any circumstances of any aid. But for the moment, we're stopping it until you do a sit down and agree to talk to the Russians. If we did that, I think that might have an impact. But we're not willing to do that. We're not taking the whole matter seriously. And indeed, we fixed it so that this notion of sitting there and saying, maybe then somehow, okay, something good happens here now and again, it's a waste of his time. We have interests, but they are not in Ukraine. We have an interest in stability and peace, an end to the conflict. We will support that, but Zelensky doesn't want that. If he refuses to do that, then we're out, and he should get us out. We don't need to be there. We don't need to waste any more time, money, or resources on Ukraine. We already have the Inspector General telling us that 50% of everything we've sent has effectively been lost in corruption. We're finding members of the drug cartels, their armed elements walking around with Javelin missiles. What else do we have to do before we finally say enough? So I don't know who is advising the president, but he's not getting good advice. So we look like a teenager on TikTok. We go through one video, oh, that's nice. No, we don't like that. We go to another one. And this is not the art of the deal. International relations don't lend themselves to transactional outcomes. The art of diplomacy is the art of the possible. If it's not possible, we should walk and be done with it. Because in the final analysis, we have no vital strategic interest in Ukraine. I'm not entirely surprised because President Trump, unfortunately, has frequently been most influenced by the last person who spoke to him. And he's far too emotional. And showing him pictures of dead children or something like that has a profound impact. That's one of the ways that we got involved in Syria with the various missile strikes. The rationale for them, I think on the one hand, you have this desperate need or perceived need, quote, get a win for the president. And the president, who made lots of, I would say, incautious statements about the war in Ukraine, had told everyone, I can end this in a day. That, of course, has gone by the wayside. And now I can sit down and force these two people to negotiate with each other. That hasn't worked. And he's been trying to get Zelensky to sign on for a ceasefire. And Zelensky, of course, has been unwilling to do so unless it meets his needs, which is obviously to continue the war. So I think they decided if we can get something on paper that looks like Americans are going to benefit. In other words, somehow or another, Americans are going to get $1 trillion worth of mineral wealth out of Ukraine. Then the president looks like a winner. This is the transactional mentality that he's adopted, and everyone goes home happy. In truth, then you get a new group of people to talk. Charles or Chaz Freeman said it best many years ago to me. He says we get a president in with a new administration, and they proceed to lobotomize Washington. In other words, throw everything overboard and start over, as though they have the answer. And the fresh set of eyes will prove brilliant. This is being catastrophic for us because other nations look for long-term strategic organization and goals that lead, hopefully, to prosperity and peace. We haven't even done that over the last 90 to 100 days under President Trump. That's what he did, because he knew we were tied up in Vietnam. There was not much we could do militarily if the Soviets really wanted to go into Czechoslovakia, which of course they did. I think that in the United States, once it becomes clear what the Russians are going to do, Donald Trump is going to lose face. His administration will be shown for what it is: incoherent, unfocused, and failing. Who knows what the consequences politically for him will be, because everyone in Congress will attack him. And I'm sure he'll be told that he's responsible for losing Ukraine, which is nonsense. Ukraine was never his to begin with. He didn't want it. But instead of being smart and bailing out of this nonsense early on, he listened to all the wrong people and is stuck like a bug on flypaper. But he'll be held responsible. In Europe itself, all of the leadership in Europe will be identified as buffoons, because there's not a damn thing they can do. And if they try to do something, I think in most cases, the military leaders, certainly on the continent, will meet with them and say, we can't intervene. We have no, Ukraine must stand fast on its demands. This is a catastrophe for the West. It's a catastrophe for the United States. Any opportunity, any chance whatsoever that we had to normalize relations with Russia are gone. These things are over. We now are seen as unambiguously as a co-belligerent. And anything that President Trump tries to undertake with Russia will be seen as completely unbelievable. There will be no credibility attached to any that he says or does. It's a serious mistake. Again, it destroys his opportunity to credibly talk with President Putin. He's essentially joined with the very people who were aligned with the Biden administration, and they are now desperate to keep the war going. Everyone that you mentioned, from Tusk to Starmer, these are globalists. These are the people that opened Europe's borders to invasion, that invited millions of people from the Middle East and Africa, North Africa specifically, to march into their countries. More recently, Starmer has said anyone who wants to come to Great Britain from India can live here for 3 years without paying any taxes. These people are absolutely determined to destroy the character, culture. President Putin believes in religion as a key component of the nation's moral compass. This is something that President Trump should understand. I think he's very confused, or he simply doesn't know. He should have to explain it. I think Fetterman represents large numbers of people on the Hill. Truthfully, they may say thank you for your service, but they feel contempt for the people that do it. I don't think that's true for President Trump, and I know for a fact that he's always been very concerned by the vulnerability of the forces that we have on the ground. That's one of the reasons he's directed the withdrawal from Syria. Now, I leave it to you and others, Dan, to tell us whether or not he's actually pulled the troops out, because we know that President Trump in the past gave orders to remove forces from an area, and those forces never left. So I don't know what the facts on the ground are, but he directed the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria. He ought to get them out of Iraq. There's no reason for them to be there. There hasn't been for a long time. And the Iraqi government wants them to leave. And I think we're going to discover increasingly that our forces in Jordan, and we do have troops in Jordan, are at risk, because that government is very fragile, and it's not quite clear what would happen in the event of a larger war to our forces there. The bottom line is, I do know that Trump cares about those things, but I'm rather unconvinced that the majority of people on the Hill are knowledgeable or care. Yeah. It's callous for me to say that, but I've been looking at this now, certainly since I left the Army, for about 20 years. And even before I left, I began to see a lot of evidence for this. There's much less concern than there should be. You can see this on YouTube, any of a number of different outlets, Rumble, X. It's out there. It went very well. It seems to have done well. It's piling up views, despite the fact that, of course, it's subject to the algorithms. The one exception, of course, is Starmer sitting out there on that island. He may think he can do something, but he's probably in even worse shape. Right now, the Polish army is much larger, more capable than the British army or the French army. And they're not going to take this on. They know what's out there. They're not ready for it. So I think this will hasten the end of the globalist regimes, which is a good thing for Europe. They need to go away. All of these globalists need to be canned. And unfortunately, the message that we represent, which is obviously, as you and I have been discussing, an America First message, a real American First message, is not popular on YouTube. So we have to fight our way through that. And we're getting a lot of inquiries now from other networks. We'll see how it goes. We're on to our next episode, which should be out in about 10 days to 2 weeks, and that's on war. It's very much about what you and I are discussing right now. And then the next episode beyond that is a discussion of truth. They're never going to see anything remotely like that. And what's even more discouraging is there is contained in this agreement the promise of American military assistance as part of the reciprocity involved with our first access to whatever mineral wealth is there. And then secondly, most of this is really about oil, gas, and aluminum. I'm not sure why we are desperate for any oil or gas that comes out of Ukraine. I would think that would go probably to Europe. As far as aluminum is concerned, I'm sure we can always use it. But the real question is, why would this president put what started out as a very good attempt to normalize relations with Moscow and to bring this war to an end has now suddenly changed horses, run back to Zelensky, who is about as reliable as the wind at this point? I mean, he is literally the captain of the Titanic, and then presenting some agreement that he signed as evidence for goodness and power and strength and glory for Trump. For them, as you've just pointed out in his discussion of the importance of this holiday to the Russian national identity and survival that he was discussing with the children, then you can imagine almost anything happening. Now, I think the last thing that he wants is to use a nuclear weapon. That's not something he wants to do. And frankly, why would he? Because Ukraine is right on his border. You don't want to use nuclear weapons on your borders under any and all circumstances if you can avoid it. So I don't think that's the case. But just about anything else shy of a nuclear strike is eminently possible. Listen, only a lunatic on either side would suggest the use of a nuclear weapon. I'm sorry, because there's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. We talk about this all the time. It's only 5 kilotons. It's only 9 kilotons. If you use a nuclear weapon against a nuclear armed power, the probability of rapid escalation is about 100%, because your assumption is that the next thing that comes your way is an intercontinental ballistic missile attack. Why wait for it? So you would be inclined under those circumstances to launch first. Now, I don't think President Putin, and by the way, I don't think President Trump, neither of these men are remotely interested in using nuclear weapons. But I think what he's trying to say is that it makes no sense. Obviously, we don't know precisely what it means, but the fact that we are going to tie ourselves in any way, shape, or form to this dying Ukrainian state and regime presents a threat to Russia for the reasons that you've outlined. We are ultimately a belligerent in this war. Ukraine is simply the facade for our war against Russia. One would assume that President Trump understands that, and if he genuinely wants to end it, he's got to abandon it. I think if you're sitting overseas right now, wherever you are, you see the United States government like a teenager on TikTok who watches for a while, slides to a new video, and then says, oh, I've changed my mind. I'm going to look at this now. There doesn't seem to be any consistency. We have a crisis of inconsistency in policy and behavior in Washington. Of course not. It's ridiculous. These discussions, if you want to call them even a coherent discussion, I don't think this is. But whatever you're going to talk about in terms of potential action that the United States government may take, because we've decided to treat Russia as the enemy. Essentially, we're the Biden administration with a new face on it. And that's very disappointing. And I don't think that's what we voted for. Unfortunately, he has still received missiles and launchers that could enable him to strike at Moscow and other Russian cities. I don't think there's any question about that. This is one of the reasons why President Trump has missed such an historic opportunity to develop better relations with the Russians. This was essentially Alexander Solzhenitsyn's message. The Russians needed to give up the empire, to drop all of these non-Russians inside their country and essentially become a Russian state as opposed to a multinational conglomerate held together by force. So he doesn't want to do that. He's a follower of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He would like to have good relations with the Ukrainians, whom he views as Orthodox Christian Slavic brothers. But we've made that almost impossible because of our support for the worst elements in Ukraine at this time. So I think it's a real threat. And if it is carried out, if it's done, almost anything is possible for the Russians. In other words, they're on the same sheet of music. President Trump needs to get control of his administration. There are too many people that are pursuing policy goals that are completely divorced from what President Trump has said repeatedly that he wants to achieve. And his number one objective was to end the war and restore relations with Russia. Now, that's where everyone should be. Obviously, that's not the case. Now, he's apparently fired Mr. Waltz from his position. Perhaps that will help, since Mr. Waltz is a strident advocate for war with everyone, frankly. That could help, but I don't know. We have roughly 120 installations, military installations in Japan.
Wow, 120?
Yes. Now, they're not all giant, but there are that many installations. You're talking about intelligence, and that means to BlackRock and Monsanto and any number of different major firms in the United States who want to get their hands on the agricultural potential of Western Ukraine. He is quite willing to sell anything to anybody right now in Ukraine in order to stay in power. And this is just empty bluster. Now, what will they actually discuss in Turkey? Who knows? But we know from experience that if you come back and you make it abundantly clear that the Russians are going to retain what they've taken on the ground, that you are going to have to recognize the legitimacy of what they've taken and opt absolutely for true neutrality on the Austrian model, as I've mentioned many times, I suspect these people will probably go home and be executed. So the question is, why should any of this be taken seriously by Moscow? I think Moscow wants to end the war. Moscow wants to also maintain its position of legitimacy with not only Europeans, but with the global South, with the rest of the world, because right now, Russia is seen as having been from the beginning on the right side. Ukraine is widely seen as the problem. The truth is, Ukraine was just utilized by us. Ukrainians were exploited by us. Ukrainians had no say in the matter whatsoever. So this is all quite pointless in my judgment, but I'm sure that the Russians will sit down with them and we'll see what comes out of it. But as far as we are concerned, I think President Trump, his Secretary of State, are irrelevant now to the process. If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And I think that sums up the Trump administration. It doesn't know where it's headed. It doesn't know what it wants. There is no coherent strategy. There never has been. There was no strategy under Biden other than let's harm Russia. Right now, we've half signed on for the Biden policy, but we're still holding out hope for something else. At the end of the day, this is the path to irrelevance. It's the path to nowhere. And that's the path that President Trump and his administration are on with Russia. And then stop and consider, as we've talked before, when you sit down and you're talking with the Russians, you're also forging potentially the potential for understanding with other countries. Remember that Russia has an enormous standing in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and they can be extraordinarily helpful to us in dealing with China and other countries. We know that the Japanese have now effectively signed on with China to oppose us and our tariffs because we offended them pointlessly, made outrageous demands, and they said, fine, we'll do business with China. You can go and do whatever you like, and we'll do business not in dollars, but in our own currency. And this ultimately is the theme right now since the tariffs. The de-dollarization is begun globally. So all of this is a disaster because no one from the very beginning had a clear